Welcome to Gatecrashers, a podcast dedicated to kicking open the door to your next favorite thing. Our mission, our creed, our code is this: to make all things more approachable and accessible to everyone. We want you to find a universe that you'll fall in love with. Hi, my name is Ashley, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm actually the prose editor at Gatecrashers, and I am here to help you find your next favorite book. Joining me today in that quest is the author of the best-selling book series, Dangerous Damsels. Already started. And that is India Holton. The first book in our series, The Wisteria Society for Lady Scoundrels, debuted last year and found itself making the New York Times list of most notable books of 2021. Today, we'll be discussing India's second installment into the world of house-flying pirates and witches who definitely don't exist in the League of Gentlewomen Witches. Hi, India. Welcome to Gatecrashers.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. So it's actually a tradition for us at Gatecrashers to start every interview with a really significant question. So prepare yourself. What is your favorite sandwich?
That is such a good question because my favorite sandwich is attached to a really lovely memory. It's ham with honey grain mustard and salad on sourdough bread. And I first had it at a summer fair at a Waldorf school. And so whenever I try to recreate it, I think back to that lovely day.
It's wonderful when we can attach food to like a really lovely memory. Oh, that sounds so good. Now, before we actually start talking witches, I wanted to ask you about your first book, The Wisteria Society for Lady Scoundrels. I actually feel slightly biased because I named this my favorite release of 2021, but it was really unlike anything I had ever read before. To listeners, if you haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, you can picture Victorian London, only filled with pirates who fly battle houses through the clouds, a band of advanced in years lady buccaneers who spend their days drinking tea and politely trying to find interesting ways to off each other, and a heroine who really longs to join their ranks. And she's followed up with a hero cinnamon roll who has more aliases than you can even name. My first thought after really finishing that first book was, where did you come up with the idea for this book? And what type of research did you do to really flesh out Victorian London? Because as listeners might not know, I think you're based in New Zealand. What was that process like for you?
Well, it started really abruptly. I was minding my own business one afternoon and suddenly Cecilia and Miss Darlington popped into my imagination. I pictured these two very elegant ladies drinking tea and polishing their pearl-handled guns and immediately wanted to know, who are these people? And so I wrote the book to find out, basically. But I have been studying history for more years than I'd like to admit. So I was pretty familiar with the period anyway, and I did a lot of spot researching as I went along. So if they were in a particular area, I went to Google Maps and I walked around that area virtually, and then I researched what it was like in the Victorian era. I researched clothing and the history of any building that they went into. And it was lots of fun for me because I love researching. But it could get pretty time consuming too, because I would spend hours researching, for example, a library in Bath.
Yeah.
And the route to get there and the history of the library and the people who created it and so forth. And then I would send Cecilia walking towards it and she would get distracted and never make it there. So my hours of research were for nothing.
I do feel especially if you're someone who really enjoys history, that the researching portion of writing can be really scratch a great itch for anyone who loves that. So I'm not surprised to hear that, but that's so great. Now, when we get to the second book, the natural rivals of the Wisteria Society for Lady Scoundrels happen to be the League of Gentlewomen Witches. They're like the main focus of the second novel. Something I noticed and I loved within both of the books was kind of like this seamless integration of like works of like classic female authors. You're not like really retelling these stories, which you can sometimes find a lot of times today, but your heroines are quite often like identifying with them and really like living through experiences they've had. So why was it actually important for you to include classic works of literature in your series?
It's kind of embarrassing, really. It started with the first sentence of Wisteria. I wanted to have a bookish heroine who loved to read books that were suitable at that time. And I'm really bad at first sentences. So I borrowed the first sentence of Jane Eyre, more or less, as a way to introduce the character. And it kind of snowballed from there. It went to being the first sentence of every chapter, and then it went to being, the underpinning of the plot, and then it went to being about the theme of the novel and the next novel and the novel after that. So, yeah. But
it's really done in like such a unique way that I applaud you for, because it's especially for people who are bookish and love to read those types of works of literature, it's such a fun like escape to find them in your work.
Yeah, it was so much fun to make a list of all these quotes and to pick one for each chapter heading and for many of the scenes through the book, and to see how suitable they were so often, and to match ones that just were perfect for the action at the time. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I hope I'm not, like, I don't think I'm spoiling anything, but the second, Jane Austen obviously has a huge influence on the second book. And I'm a huge Jane Austen fan. So reading that, it was so fun to get to pick out all those little bits of quotes that you had hidden in there. It almost felt like an in-joke, like if you had the previous reading or knowledge to it, you could pick them out. It just added this extra layer of like comedy to it.
Jane Austen was great because her tone is relatively similar to mine, although she's a genius and I'm not. But but it was particularly fun to use her. And I hope that people who don't know those classic books still get the benefit of having that included.
I would think so, because obviously Jane lends herself to having some, she really lends her quotes lean towards like a snarky side almost. So even if you're not familiar, the way that they play out, I do think that it will be funny regardless if you're a Jane Austen fan. Now, much of the humor I find in your books, like, really lies in extremely like well-crafted comedic prose. And every time I pick one up, like I laugh like a crazy person. Like my husband, he really does like know when I'm reading or like rereading one of your books, because it's just like a different type of laugh. I said this to him. I often feel like, they feel somewhat like written for me, which as a reader feels like really fun. Everything about them just really speaks to like the type of humor that I love. For most writers, I feel like finding the right word when they're writing is obviously like an incredibly important part of the writing process. But for your books, it almost feels like somewhat integral to the comedic timing. How does the need for precise wording affect your writing process? And like, how do you go about finding exactly what you need, especially considering some of it is wording from a time period that isn't necessarily like dialogue or verbiage that we would use today?
Right. Well, a lot of my writing history involved quite lyrical works. So I lean quite heavily on the cadence of the text, and I find that works quite well. Like it adds to the comedy if you've got that rhythm going. Comedy is very rhythmic. So I listen with that particular ear to how words sound in a sentence. But I also spend half my day checking the thesaurus, for just the right word. And that's a bit of a problem because for some reason I always check the online thesaurus. And so I'll go online to look for a word, and then I'll just check my email at the same time and, just have a quick look at Twitter. And half an hour later, I go back to my manuscript and think, oh, no, I still need that word. And so I start again.
Now, jumping off the importance of word choice, I have to know how you go about naming your characters, actually, because frankly, I am really obsessed with names, and I can really appreciate an unusual name. And I something I actually really enjoy about your books that if anyone who hasn't read it yet doesn't know, is you actually include somewhat of a cast list in the beginning, and you give these little snippets of who these people are coming up, and it just kind of gets you excited to eventually meet them. But when you go through that cast list, I just find the names so hysterical and well thought out, and I just want to know how important the naming process is for you, and really what is your method to name these people.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'm a bit inspired by Dickens there, because his names were always just so hilarious, and they said so much about the characters. So I sort of try to make names that are not so much meaningful, but give you a sense of the character. But to be honest, most characters come with their own names, like Miss Plum and Mrs. Pettifer. Those names arrived before the characters even did. So they kind of somehow name themselves. The ones that don't, like Cecilia, for example, take forever to find their name because they're like fully fledged people already, and you've got to find a name to match them. And it can be tricky sometimes. So it takes a while to go through all these different names till you finally find the one that clicks.
Have you ever had to go back and change someone's name that wasn't working?
Oh, yeah. Well, Cecilia was Cecily for probably half the first draft until I realized that she needed something a bit stronger. And so it just sort of morphed into Cecilia. And then I can't imagine her any other way.
It's a great name for her. I love it. Speaking actually of your characters, aside from strong heroines, I am actually really most drawn to the way that you write men. As a love interest, they feel like they each have their own purpose. They're well thought out, and they're just as cultivated as the women in your books, which there can sometimes be an imbalance in other texts. But with yours, I felt like they were extremely balanced, both of your characters. And the men never feel like they're a plot device to the women. They're never there to put them down. They're not there just as a purpose to rescue almost. They're often really seen, they're seen deferring congenially to these marauding women in their lives and really valuing the independence of the heroine. What made you want to write these types of men and heroes in your books?
I think that, sorry, just gathering my train of thought.
No, you're fine.
Okay, breathe. So for me, writing male characters that were layered and textured and weren't just there to support the heroine's story is actually part of my whole interest in writing feminist stories, because I believe that men are as impacted by toxic patriarchy as women are, and I wanted to explore that through my male characters. So that was a large part of why I crafted them the way I did. Plus, the minute they appeared on the page, I just sort of fell in love with them, and it was
so did I.
And it was just sort of about enjoying who they were as characters, because especially Ned was so much fun. and Alex was really layered.
Mm-hmm.
So just getting to know them was, I tend to be quite a pantser when it comes to my characters. I just let them do what they want.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, speaking actually of Alex, all of the men in your books do carry some sort of like trauma. Obviously, something to propel them is a reason why we write and plot, and you need those things for it to move forward. But Pirate Alex in the League of Gentlewomen Witches, he really did face like some really exceptional like demons, and he held really tight prejudices that were a result of his childhood. What type of research like went into crafting his story, and why did you want to tell his story specifically?
Well, I was actually a trauma counsellor many years ago. Mm-hmm. So my training is in counselling and in relationship violence. And I feel that it's quite important to me to tell stories that show that characters, sorry, it's very early in the morning.
No, you're fine. Take your time.
It's really important for me to tell stories that show that people can experience trauma and not be fully healed from that trauma, mm-hmm. and still have a life that's full of joy and adventure and excitement and love, and can get their happy ending even if they're not fully healed yet.
Yeah.
And the women characters in my book are so busy doing things that their story is quite active, but the men are sort of, it's not that they're in a secondary role, but they have more of a chance to develop their emotional processes.
Yeah.
And with Alex, it was a wonderful chance to show that you could be strong and still vulnerable at the same time, and that you could overcome some really terrible things and still have a fantastic life.
It definitely came across, and it felt very visceral and real, but also sensitive to the experiences that he was obviously dealing with. As a reader, it was really impactful while reading it, which, not that, I don't know, I guess when you're you think you're starting to read a comedy, which is still funny, it is just really nice to also have that layered bit of emotion in there, and that feels so real to him, especially. Now, as like a counterpoint to Alex, we actually have Charlotte, who is a witch, which when you read the book, like they're not supposed to be there. It's not a real thing. So she often lived her life through the methods of her favorite like literary heroines that she had read. I actually have a neurodivergent son. And while I was reading some of her moments in the book, the things that she was going through and the methods that she was relying on really reminded me actually of like scripting in social situations. And I was just wondering if this was actually a conscious decision for her character, or was it really just like a happy accident that like some neurodivergent readers might be able to like relate to?
I can't tell you how pleased I am that you picked up on that. It's not something I've talked about before, but I'm actually autistic myself. And so the book was written completely from an autistic perspective, because I know no other perspective. And the comedy is autistic, I suppose, because it's just what I find funny and what the autistic people I know, the way that they use comedy. So, yeah, it was deliberate, but it wasn't overt in the way that I haven't gone around saying, oh, look, here are autistic characters.
Yeah.
Or neurodivergent characters. And I've done that on purpose because I really want autistic people in particular to be able to read books where the characters are similar to them, or that they can relate in some way, but that aren't going through their story just to fix an issue or just to express their neurodivergence, they're just autistic people living their lives, having adventures, and this is just the way they see the world and how they are in the world. But they're just themselves, and I don't know if that's a helpful thing or not, but it's what I love as a reader, to find books where characters, I can say, oh, I really relate to that, but they don't have a label in any way. So I'm just free to enjoy them and their story as people, if you know what I mean.
I do. And as a parent of someone on the spectrum, I really appreciate that as a reader and as a mom, just to have those little bits of normalcy to something that like maybe my son like deals with every day. And I feel a lot of times people do like to like slap a label on something and call it that, and then that's what you're known for, where really we're all just people. And in your character, I definitely got that sense that it wasn't saying it was one specific thing, but it just was this like layered added moment where I just felt like somebody else could identify with this. So I'm so pleased to hear that. That actually makes me really happy. So thank you.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I would actually like to talk about tropes a little bit with you. Oftentimes, especially in like genre fiction, there's scenarios, like the chosen one or the quest, as well as like one of my favorites, which is that like one bed left at the inn type of thing. They feel like essential to some books, also a little bit predictable in others. But something I really love about your writing style is the way that you kind of like take a trope and then just like shake it on its head a little bit. There's like a real breaking the fourth wall type of quality to your characters, like awareness of finding themselves sometimes in a trope, and then also sometimes like contriving themselves a little bit into a trope of the like romance or fantasy genre. What actually made you decide to approach them in that way?
I think I just really love reading romance, and I love tropey romance. It's like this big, huge in-joke that we all really enjoy, and I love taking part in conversations about it online and in book clubs. And so I brought a lot of tropes into my books as a celebration of that, really, and just to have fun with it. And I mean, on a deeper level too, examining the way that romance works in literature and how it supports our ideas about ourselves and about relationships and about reading and the whole course of romantic literature and all of that. But mostly it was just about having as much fun as I could.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Yeah, it's really fun for readers as well. Again, a lot of like your book feels almost like an in-joke that you as the reader are in on most of the time. It really is so fun and a very layered experience, especially if you're someone who considers yourself like somewhat bookish and really into reading. It's a really fun bit of escapism.
Thank you.
Speaking of actually romance, the romance genre as a whole, historical romance, which yours technically falls into, as well as fantasy. But speaking of historical romance, in the past, it's kind of like been known to have like a bad rap. Bodice rippers of the past, they've been looked down upon kind of as like less substantial literature. But there really actually has been a renaissance in like the past few years of like feminist historical romance works that are really filled with like important women's issues, and then also told with really sophisticated storytelling. When I think about like the next generation of romance writers, I see like a lot of spunk and modernity, like really reinvigorating the genre and really changing, I think, the perceptions and the minds of like really the gatekeepers of literature who like to look down upon it. What about reading past generations of romance made you want to break into the scene and really add your own twist to it?
Right. Well, I actually came to romance fairly late. I have been reading it for maybe 15 or 20 years now. So I missed a lot of the early romance where it was bodice ripping and a lot of dubious consent and so I missed all of that. And even now I really don't read very many of those old school romances. So for me it was actually more about fantasy. And because I grew up reading fantasy, all the wonderful old romantic fantasies written by women like Robin McKinley and Patricia Phillip.
Love Robin McKinley as well.
And they really shaped who I was as a person, as well as a reader and a writer. And then I noticed that the genre became increasingly dark and grim, and that could just be in New Zealand. We don't have a lot of books on shelves here, so the very big popular books are what you find when you go into a store. And I actually stopped reading fantasy because it was just so dark. And I turned to romance, and that gave me what I was looking for, but I still wanted that magic to be involved. And so I actually wrote Wisteria as a way to give myself something that I wanted to read, romantic fantasy that was more feminine, for want of a better word, light and uplifting and cheerful and hopeful. And it was just perfect timing because other people were starting to do the same. So that's where I come from in terms of speaking to the history of literature. And I was concerned about the environment of fantasy, but historical romance gave me so much to add to it that I'm so grateful that I started to read it.
It really does feel like this lovely marriage between the two genres that and it does feel like very different even from other romance fantasy that's out there. And that's not to say one is better than the other. It's got such a light, airy quality to it that I feel like a lot of I read a ton of romance fantasy. It's just generally what I am interested in reading. And you're right. A lot of fantasy does lend itself to 3-book lead up to a war or something that feels extremely heavy to the world. This just feels so magical that it really is just an escape through the clouds. That
darker or more intense fantasy is actually really important too, and we've needed it for so long.
Yes.
And it helps us address really powerful issues, and it reflects so much of what's happening in the world today.
It does, but it's nice to have a balance too.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Now, often between your characters in the books, you really do love to just kind of ratchet up the tension between them with extremely witty banter, and also their time between the sheets. So your books, they like to really run wild with humor, but you really do maintain your voice when you transition into more romantic scenes. What is it like trying to craft a sex scene while maintaining your writing style, especially if it's a very comedic one?
Yeah, it's hard. Because I'm autistic, there are some words that I can't say or write. And so, I've had to make a virtue out of that. And so, there are a lot of euphemisms in my scenes that I've deliberately added to the comedy simply because, I can't go too close to some of the action. But I find those scenes to be very, very technical. More so than any other scenes. There's a lot of choreography, a lot of emotional layering, a lot of word choice that has to be just right. And then on the other side, you've got the characters telling you what they want to do. And sometimes you have to say, no, you can't do that.
I love discussing writing with authors. It's so nice to just know that these characters that live within us now are really just like a part of you, and they speak to you so often.
Definitely. Yes, absolutely. I'm very much like that. My characters are very, very real to me.
So just as like a little fun, somewhat final question, what actually is your favorite piece of classical literature or heroine? Or like, is there one you identify with, or one that like lives in your heart more than another one?
That's not a fun question.
No, I know. I felt evil as I wrote it. I'm like, I can't pick.
I could no sooner choose a favorite star in the heavens.
Yeah.
I mean, I love everything that Jane Austen has written.
Mm-hmm.
Probably Emma would be my favorite because it's just so funny and witty and clever and deep, and I love all the puns and the snarky humor. And, so if I had to choose, it would probably be Emma.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many wonderful books.
I know.
Yeah.
I actually named my son after the Bennets. I named him Bennett because I am such their story. Like, I love it so much that I get that though. Like, they just become characters, like become ingrained in who you are and the life that you lead. It was so reading your books was really fun to see characters that also identified in that way and lived in that way. It's such a nice thing to identify with.
Yeah, no, I put that little bit of myself into both my heroines, that that love for literature and how it shapes who we are in our everyday life, and how it inspires us to be better if we can. Yeah.
So to close this out, what is actually next for you? What do you have coming up?
Okay, so there is a third book in the Dangerous Damsels series.
Yay.
It's coming out next year, and it has a title and it has a release date, but I'm going to be mysterious and not tell you.
Okay.
Just yet. But I can let you know that it has both main characters are neurodivergent, and there are secrets and shenanigans and aerial battles and interesting tattoos and only one bed.
Oh, yay! You're ringing so many of my bells. I'm very excited. I'm eagerly awaiting it. And if anybody else is interested, you should get it now on the ground floor. Read the other two because I'm very excited for this third one. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me. This has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I've had a lovely time.
Thank you. I was so nervous. I was hoping this was going to be fun for you as well. I wasn't sure. Okay, great. So to our listeners, if you're interested in finding more out about author India Holton, you can find her on Twitter at India Holton and on Instagram at India.Holton. You can pick up both the Wisteria Society for Lady Scoundrels and the League of Gentlewomen Witches today at your local independent bookstore or wherever fine books are sold. Well, thank you so much for listening. And you can find us on Twitter at gatecrasherspod, and find me at Ashley Axe. I'd love to hear what you're currently reading. And if you pick up these titles, let us know with the hashtag #ReadWithGC. Thanks so much, everyone. Until next time.